Imagine having absolute power. Not just influence, not just wealth, but the kind of power where your word becomes law, where your desire becomes reality, where thousands of people wake up every morning knowing their entire existence depends on your mood that day. Now imagine throwing it all away, destroying your reputation, your marriage, your legacy, your credibility as a ruler, all for one person, all for love. But here's where the story gets darker. That person is a child. This is the true story of King Fredrik I of Sweden, and I need to warn you right now, this isn't a simple tale of villainy. This is something far more unsettling, because Fredrik wasn't an evil man hunting innocent victims. He was a man completely, utterly, devastatingly consumed by something he couldn't control, something that would cost him everything. Let's go back to 1730. Sweden is experiencing a golden age. The treasury is full, the military is strong, the kingdom is respected across Europe. And King Fredrik? He's 43 years old, well-respected, politically savvy, and he has exactly what every powerful man in history has wanted: a wife who was considered beautiful, a son to carry on his name, and complete dominion over his realm. By all accounts, Fredrik should have been content, but something was missing. Something Fredrik couldn't quite name, couldn't quite suppress, and couldn't quite ignore.
Then, one evening in late autumn, a young boy arrived at court. His name was Claes Ekblad, and he was 14. He came from a noble family, bright and charming, with the kind of innocent grace that only exists in adolescence. He was brought to court as a page, a common position for young noblemen being groomed for future service. No one thought anything of it. It was normal. It was routine. It was perfectly ordinary. But for Fredrik, the moment he saw this boy, something shifted inside him. Something broke. Something awakened that had been buried so deeply that Fredrik himself probably didn't fully understand it. What makes Fredrik's story so extraordinary isn't that he developed an attachment to someone inappropriate. History is littered with powerful men making terrible decisions. What makes his story unforgettable is what he actually did about it, what he was willing to sacrifice, how openly, how boldly, how recklessly he pursued this obsession while the entire court watched in horror and confusion. Within weeks, Fredrik became fixated. He would find reasons to be near Claes. He would engineer situations to speak with him privately. He would give him special privileges, exclusive access, attention that was absolutely unmistakable to anyone paying attention. And people were definitely paying attention. The Swedish court was a place of constant observation, of whispered conversations, of careful political maneuvering. Everyone saw what was happening. Everyone understood what it meant. But no one knew how to stop it. How do you confront a king? How do you tell absolute power that it's making a terrible mistake?
What's genuinely tragic is that Fredrik knew. Somewhere deep inside, Fredrik understood exactly how this looked. He understood the danger he was creating. He understood the scandal that would follow. And he did it anyway. Because sometimes the pull of the heart is stronger than the weight of the crown. Sometimes love, or whatever Fredrik believed this to be, overrides logic, shame, and survival instinct itself. The whispers started almost immediately. Court members began questioning what they were witnessing. Some were sympathetic, some were horrified, some were simply confused, trying to make sense of a king who seemed to be jeopardizing everything for a teenage boy. Fredrik's wife, Queen Ulrika Eleonora, who had been a dutiful queen and a faithful spouse, began to realize that her marriage was fundamentally changing. The man she had committed her life to was disappearing into an obsession that excluded her completely. But here's what makes this story truly human and deeply tragic. Fredrik wasn't pretending. He wasn't hiding his feelings behind diplomatic smiles or political necessity. He was actually, genuinely, hopelessly consumed. And the more people judged him, the more he pushed back. The more scandal grew, the more defiantly he clung to Claes. It was as if he had decided that if he was going to be condemned anyway, he might as well make it worth his while. By 1734, Fredrik made a decision that shocked even the most jaded observers at court.
He decided to marry off his wife, not to another man, which would have been scandalous enough, but strategically, purposefully, to someone who could take her far from Sweden. He essentially banished his own queen from his court, from his presence, from his life. And he did it so that Claes Ekblad could have an even more prominent role in the royal household, so that the boy could be elevated, celebrated, and positioned right beside the throne itself. What Fredrik didn't realize was that his actions weren't just creating scandal, they were setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually destroy everything he had built. They were the beginning of his downfall, and they were about to introduce complications he absolutely could not have foreseen. Because here's what Fredrik missed in his obsession. Claes Ekblad wasn't just a passive participant in this story. He was a real person with his own ambitions, his own fears, his own agenda. And when you give a teenage boy that much power, that much access to a king, that much influence at the highest level of government, things become infinitely more dangerous than a simple scandal about forbidden attraction.
Here's something that history often gets wrong about court scandals. We imagine them as simple stories about desire and consequence, but the reality is far more complex. The reality involves calculation, manipulation, ambition, and people who are far smarter than we expect them to be. Claes Ekblad was intelligent, more than intelligent actually. He was shrewd. From the moment he realized the king's feelings toward him, from the moment he understood the extraordinary advantage this gave him, Claes began playing the game of court politics with the skill of someone twice his age. A 14-year-old boy who had somehow managed to capture the complete, undivided attention of the most powerful man in Sweden. Do you understand what that means? Do you grasp the opportunity that represents? Most of us never get that kind of leverage in our entire lives. Claes had it at an age when most children are still figuring out who they want to be, and he was going to use it. The relationship between Fredrik and Claes shifted over the following years. It became less about the raw obsession of those early days and more about something calculated, something structured. Fredrik began bringing Claes into political meetings. He started consulting the boy on matters of state. A 14-year-old was now influencing Swedish foreign policy. A teenager was shaping decisions that would affect thousands of lives. To understand how absurd this was, imagine if the President of the United States suddenly decided his closest advisor should be a child. Imagine if every major decision went through that child's hands first. That was Sweden in the mid-1730s. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. The Swedish nobility couldn't simply remove the boy. They couldn't just confront Fredrik and demand an end to this madness, because Claes was protected by the king's complete devotion. Any move against Claes was a move against Fredrik. Any criticism of the relationship was treason. Any attempt to separate them would require either Claes or the king to disappear, and neither option was politically possible. So the court adapted. That's what courts do. They shift, they bend, they find ways to work within impossible situations. Some nobles began cultivating relationships with Claes, understanding that access to him was access to the king. Others tried to maintain distance, disgusted by what they were witnessing but powerless to stop it. And still others began whispering in the shadows, plotting, waiting, understanding that this situation could not possibly last forever. Eventually, something would have to give. Queen Ulrika Eleonora, meanwhile, had to watch her marriage dissolve in real time. She had to endure the humiliation of being replaced, sidelined, made irrelevant by a child. And she had to do this in a culture where divorce was unthinkable, where abandonment was a scandal that would follow her forever, where her only option was to accept her new reality and pretend to understand it. The human suffering here was almost unbearable. A woman who had done nothing wrong, who had been a faithful queen, who had given her life to the crown, was being cast aside because her husband had become obsessed with a teenager. But Fredrik wasn't thinking about his wife's suffering anymore.
He wasn't thinking about the damage this was doing to the royal family, to the Swedish government, to his own legacy. He was thinking about Claes, about proximity to Claes, about what would happen if Claes left, if Claes found someone else, if Claes stopped needing him. That's the thing about obsession. It erases everything else. It doesn't just take up space in your mind. It colonizes your entire existence. It becomes the lens through which you see everything. Fredrik was looking at his kingdom, his wife, his responsibilities, his legacy, and all he could see was the potential loss of this one boy. That's not love. That's something darker. That's something that looks like love from the outside, but functions like control from the inside. By 1740, Claes had become essentially a co-ruler. Not officially, of course. The paperwork still said Fredrik was king, but anyone paying attention understood the reality. Claes was making decisions. Claes was dispensing favors. Claes was building his own network of allies and supporters. A 24-year-old former page had somehow become one of the most powerful people in Sweden. It would have been extraordinary if it wasn't so disturbing. And that's when things got genuinely dangerous. Because as Claes aged, as he became more confident in his position, as he started to understand the full extent of his power, something started to change. He began to realize that Fredrik was aging too, that the king was in his 50s now, that the intense passion that had driven Fredrik to abandon his wife and remake his entire life might not last forever. And if it didn't, Claes would lose everything.
This is where the story shifts from being about obsession and becomes about desperation. Claes understood that he needed to secure his position. He couldn't rely on Fredrik's feelings forever. He needed something more concrete, something written down, something that would protect him even if the king's affection wavered. So Claes began taking steps to strengthen his hold over the king. He became closer to Fredrik, not more distant. He became more indispensable, not less, and he started suggesting that they do something that would make their connection permanent in a way that went beyond mere affection. He suggested marriage. Let that sink in for a moment. A 50-something-year-old king, a 24-year-old former page who had somehow become his closest advisor. The suggestion of marriage. Not because Sweden accepted such things, not because it was legal, not because anyone thought it was a good idea, but because Claes understood something that Fredrik had forgotten. Once you're willing to sacrifice everything for someone, you'll eventually be willing to sacrifice anything. And if you make that sacrifice legal, if you make it official, if you make it something that can't be undone or taken away, then you've truly won. But Claes had miscalculated. He didn't understand that there are limits even to obsession. He didn't grasp that there are lines that even a devoted king cannot cross without destroying everything he's built. And he definitely didn't anticipate what would happen next. The court erupted, not in quiet whispers this time, but in actual, undeniable outrage. Nobles who had tolerated the situation for years suddenly found their breaking point. The idea of formalizing this relationship, of making it something legal and official and permanent, was too much. It was one thing to allow a king his personal indulgences. It was another thing entirely to make those indulgences the foundation of the state itself. That's when the real power players began to move. That's when people who had been waiting in the shadows, who had been biding their time, who understood that Fredrik's obsession was destroying the kingdom, that's when they finally decided to act. And what happened next would change everything. Not just for Fredrik and Claes, but for the entire trajectory of Swedish history. History has a way of humbling the powerful. Just when you think someone is invincible, just when it seems like they've managed to reshape the world according to their desire, everything crumbles. And it usually happens faster than anyone expects. The year was 1738. Fredrik had been obsessed with Claes for 8 years. 8 years of scandal, of neglect, of increasingly blatant displays of favoritism that had poisoned the court and confused the entire kingdom. But those 8 years had also been long enough for the Swedish nobility to organize, long enough for them to recognize the threat, and long enough for them to understand that Fredrik wasn't going to stop on his own. What happened next was a quiet, coordinated coup. Not a violent overthrow, not a public rebellion, but something far more effective. A systematic removal of power. The nobility, led by men who understood that the kingdom's survival depended on restraining the king, began marginalizing Claes. They stopped consulting him. They stopped including him in discussions. They treated him with the coldness that comes from collective decision. It was like watching someone slowly realize that the world around them is closing in, that the power they thought was absolute was actually always conditional. But more importantly, they moved against Fredrik himself. They didn't depose him, they didn't challenge his authority outright. Instead, they engineered his abdication. They made it clear to Fredrik that if he wanted to keep Claes in his life, if he wanted to avoid complete humiliation and potential violence, he needed to step down. He needed to transfer power to someone else, someone who could be trusted to govern according to reason instead of passion. And Fredrik, facing the choice between maintaining his crown or losing his relationship with Claes, chose Claes. He abdicated. He gave up the throne of Sweden. After decades of ruling, after all the decisions he'd made, all the power he'd wielded, all the consequences he'd caused, he chose to step down rather than lose the boy he loved. It's almost incomprehensibly tragic. It's also deeply human. Because sometimes, when given the choice between power and love, people choose love, even when love destroys them. But here's where the story takes its cruelest turn, the one that haunts historians because it's so perfectly, painfully ironic. After Fredrik abdicated, after he gave up everything for Claes, after he made himself irrelevant in order to preserve their relationship, Claes left him. Not immediately, not publicly, but gradually, systematically, Claes distanced himself from the former king. He began building relationships with the new leadership. He started positioning himself within the new government structure. He was doing what he had always done, securing his power, calculating his advantage, adapting to changing circumstances. Fredrik spent his final years isolated, not imprisoned, but effectively separated from the political sphere he had once dominated. He watched the man he had sacrificed everything for gradually forget about him, move on, and thrive without him. It's a punishment so exquisite in its cruelty that it seems almost designed by fate itself. And Claes, he thrived. He became a trusted advisor to Fredrik's successor. He built wealth and influence that lasted for decades. He eventually married well, had children, and became a respected figure in Swedish society. He got exactly what he wanted, which was to leverage his connection to a king to secure a permanent position in the nobility. The only difference was that he also destroyed the man who had made it all possible. He consumed Fredrik completely and then discarded him. But here's what the history books often miss when they tell this story. Here's the part that makes it more than just a scandal. Fredrik wasn't a villain. He wasn't a predator in the way we understand predators today. He was a man who stumbled into an impossible situation, who allowed emotion to override judgment, and who convinced himself that he could reshape reality through sheer force of will and devotion. He was broken by love, if you can even call it that. He was destroyed by something he couldn't control. And his destruction happened not in a moment, but slowly, day by day, year by year, as the consequences of his choices accumulated. Queen Ulrika Eleonora died without ever reconciling with her husband. She never got closure. She never got an apology. She never got to witness the moment when Fredrik realized what his obsession had cost. She just died, having lived through the humiliation and pain of being replaced, of being made irrelevant, of being cast aside for a teenager. The Swedish court recovered. The new government was more stable. Order was restored. The kingdom moved forward. But something had changed in how the nobility viewed monarchy itself. They had learned that even absolute power wasn't absolute, that if a king became too unstable, too consumed by personal obsession, the nobles could remove him. It was a lesson that would ripple through European politics for decades. And Claes? He lived a long life. He accumulated wealth, respect, and a legacy that extended beyond his death. He became a minor historical footnote, remembered mainly as that boy who the king abdicated for. But he wasn't truly defined by his connection to Fredrik. He used it as a stepping stone and then moved on. He got what he wanted. He won. That's the most unsettling part of this story. The person who caused the most damage got away with it completely. The person who manipulated a king, who destroyed a marriage, who nearly brought chaos to an entire nation, that person thrived.
Fredrik spent his final years in semi-exile, occasionally visiting court, increasingly irrelevant, watching the life he had built crumble around him. He died in 1751 at 75 years old. By all accounts, he was a broken man. Not broken by regret, necessarily, but broken by the reality that his love hadn't been returned the way he needed it to be. Broken by the understanding that he had given away power for something he couldn't keep. Broken by the slow, painful recognition that the one person he had sacrificed everything for had never truly cared about him at all. History is full of warnings. This story whispers a different kind of warning than most. It's not a warning about the dangers of obsession, though that's certainly in here. It's not a warning about the corrupting nature of absolute power, though that's woven throughout. It's a warning about what happens when you stop seeing people as complete human beings and start seeing them as solutions to your own internal voids. When you project your needs onto another person, when you convince yourself that someone else is responsible for your happiness, when you sacrifice everything on the altar of another person's existence, that's when you lose. Not because the other person is bad, but because no person can ever be enough to fill the spaces inside us that should be filled by purpose, by principle, by something bigger than just one human connection. Fredrik wanted love so desperately that he was willing to destroy everything to have it. And in doing so, he became the one thing he never intended to be, a cautionary tale, a reminder that even kings can fall, that even power is fragile when it's built on obsession, that the things we hold most tightly are often the things most likely to slip through our fingers. That's the true story of the king who left his wife at the altar for a 14-year-old boy. It's not a simple story about villainy or desire. It's a deeply human story about how we destroy ourselves through the things we love, through the people we trust, through the choices we make in moments we think we can never recover from. It's a story about loss wearing the mask of devotion, and about how sometimes the fall from power is the only punishment we ever truly receive.